The changelings were universally hated. This was perfectly illogical. A leech-like parasite species that survives by puppeteering the body of its host is something any sapient capable of dreaming would have nightmares about. It didn't help that the process of acquiring a host was a rather brutal affair that involved invading the victim's brain case and lobotomizing them so as to integrate with their nervous system. Throw in the final fact that, while they weren't technically sapient themselves, they were more than capable of suborning a sapient host's brain to think for them. And it's easy to see why eradicating the parasitic abominations from the galaxy became a priority item for most species upon learning of their existence. All of which is why Chell was now on the run. Her current host, a bulky, four-armed Carthinian soldier, had been one of those who had come armed with flamethrowers to destroy her community. A tiny village the changelings had established for themselves on a remote island near Carthinia's tropical equator. The elders had prepared her for this eventuality. They had told her practically every day of her life that their village would one day be discovered, and they would be driven from Carthinia for the crimes of their kind. She had followed their orders and tried to make peace with that inevitability. It hadn't helped. Perhaps nothing could have helped, considering the sheer unadulterated trauma of returning to their isolated village after playing on the border of the forest and the beach all morning, only to find it on fire, a hellscape of pained screams, dark smoke, and the sickening smell of roasted meat coming from the charred hosts of people she grew up with. She shook her current host's head, desperately trying to banish the terrible memories from her mind. It wasn't fair, she thought bitterly. Sure, there were horrible rumors about other groups of changelings. Rogues who tormented and tortured the innocent species of the galaxy, moving from host to host and racking up a significant body count as they did so. But it wasn't like her people were in the habit of doing that. The elders had strict rules, only allowing the villagers to reproduce when a new host body was conceived to an existing one. Among her people, taking a new host outside the womb was taboo. Prior to inhabiting the soldier in self-defense, Chell had never once changed bodies in all the years she'd been alive. Now, though, things were different. Now she was one of the rogues, whether she wanted to be or not. She had fallen in with a military squad as they prepared to leave, then given them the slip once they reached the mainland and stowed away on this shuttle to the interstellar public transport void train. Hiding among the passengers, anxiously hoping against hope, none of them would notice the small telltale signs of a body being consciously, rather than subconsciously controlled. It hadn't been a problem with the soldiers. What with the armored full-body hazard suits they wore. But she'd been forced to ditch the suit and weapons upon reaching civilization. She would probably have to learn to use weapons if she wanted to survive for long in the wider galaxy. But for now at least, such things would only draw unwanted attention. The shuttle docked with the public void train, and she quietly made her way through customs, trying not to let the fear she was feeling show on her host's face. She needn't have worried. Some species were extremely sensitive to even the subtlest signs of a changeling among them, but the Carthinians weren't one of those. Flashing her host's military ID with a few grunts of affirmation to the cursory questions was all it took to gain passage in the void train's relatively crowded economy section. And just like that, she was on her way to somewhere else. Anywhere else. It didn't matter at this point. Her original host was gone. Her old life was over. She took one of the public access seats and tried desperately to hold back tears as the terrible weight of grief and guilt she'd been holding back for days began to overwhelm her. "Hey mate. Anyone sitting here?" Chell compassed herself enough to wave the stranger permission to sit next to her, avoiding looking at him as the information light came on and a friendly synthetic voice was broadcast through the entire economy section. "Welcome aboard the Orion Arm Public Access Transstellar Void Lane. Please mind your luggage and remain respectful of fellow passengers. This void train is traveling express from Carthinia to Earth. Thank you for traversing the void with us." Earth. Why did that name sound familiar? One of the elders had mentioned it once. It was a pretty famous homeworld, she remembered that much, but for which species? Chell couldn't remember. Mate, are you okay? You're crying. Chell glanced at the stranger sitting next to her, regarding her with an expression of concern. She recognized him instantly, or at least his species, from the descriptions her elders had provided. And her host's limb fluid froze solid in dread. A gaunt biped with overly long, gangly arms. And bare, artificially adorned skin. Her species' worst enemy. Human. Never go to Earth under any circumstances. That's the human's homeworld. Other species are fine to be around. So long as they don't look at you too closely, they won't notice anything. But humans see right through us. It doesn't matter the host. It doesn't matter if you move or not. Humans know. They always know. One glance is all it takes. Chell stared in utter, helpless horror as she saw a momentary flash of uneasiness in the human's eyes, followed by recognition and a lowering of his brows. Sure enough, he knew. The elders were right. He saw right through her and knew she was a monster, pretending to be a man. Sorry, I need to use the bathroom, she said, far too quickly as she jumped to her host's feet and attempted to slip past him. It didn't work, as she knew it wouldn't. The human's arm shot out far faster than should be possible for such a lanky appendage, and grasped onto her wrist with terrifying force. Chell was trapped. It was a lesser-known fact about changelings that they were incredibly weak relative to their hosts. Conscious muscle control was simply incapable of exerting nearly as much pressure as subconscious control could. Despite her current host being many times larger and stronger than her previous one had been, she still had zero chance of escaping the human's grip. All the man had to do was hang on until the authorities arrived. And he had more than enough strength for that. Take a seat. The human ordered in a low, deadly serious tone. She could practically feel the anger and disgust radiating from him. Chell tugged in vain once, before sagging in surrender, and doing as he said. So, this was how she died. The human would turn her into either the Carthinian or the Earthling government, and they would dispose of her. She was terrified, but also somehow relieved, as the last of her hope was snuffed out, and she sunk back into her seat. The stress that the worst might happen faded away. Now it had happened, and the only path left was to accept it. Maybe she could see her parents again. The human was still studying her face with a severe expression. After a long wait, he opened his mouth to speak. How long have you had this look? The human asked with a slight upward nod. He didn't need to be specific. They both knew what he was referring to. What he was asking. 3 days. She admitted reluctantly, looking away from the piercing gaze that saw straight through her, past the host, all the way to the thing inside. The human narrowed his eyes. 3 days since she killed this man. I thought so. Your lot don't usually join the military. He muttered under his breath, glaring at the rank signifier on her shoulder carapace. Chell didn't even know which rank the symbol stood for. So why then? Why did you do it? Why did you murder him? Tears sprang to her host's eyes, despite Chell's best efforts to keep them down, as the horrific memories came flooding back into her mind. Being dragged into her home by her head. Being kicked to the floor next to the corpse of her father. Her mother begging, pleading, not for her own life, but for Chell's. The soldier's sadistic laughter as he turned the flamethrower on her mom. The terrible screams that went on far too long. The terrible radiative heat, the smell. And then, there was a flash of movement, of subconscious action, and she was on him, instincts guiding her, for perhaps the first time in her life. Grabbing some sharp thing, maybe his knife, she didn't remember, to cut a hole in his face mask. A look of fear in the soldier's one visible eye, as she opened her young host's mouth, wider than Carthinian mouths were meant to open. A sense of release. A horrible, terrifying moment of exposed, naked vulnerability. Pain, blood, fear. And then her old host fell away, and she was sinking her mental fangs into the man's hideous mind. He killed my mummy and daddy. she confessed, the tears flowing freely as she broke down entirely under the weight of guilt and fear. He was going to kill me too. I didn't want to. No more words came out, just incoherent sobs and tears. She had been such an idiot, thinking she could do this. It had been obvious from the start that a stupid, sheltered girl like her could never settle into life as a rogue. She didn't even know why she'd tried. It would have been better if she'd just given up. Slowly, she became aware of arms around her as she cried. The human was hugging her, patting her on the back. That wasn't right. She pulled away, and to her surprise, the human allowed her to do so. "Your mummy and daddy." The human echoed her words back to her, his face unreadable. "How old are you?" Chell hesitated, unsure how to respond. Or why he'd even cared how old a monster like her was. Eventually, she settled on the truth. 7.5. The man looked away, a shadow of empathetic pain falling across his face as he looked away, suddenly finding it difficult to maintain eye contact. "Just a kid, I see. Look. I'm sorry for being mean just now. You don't look your age," the human said with a nervous laugh and a pained smile. He paused, looking Chell's current host up and down. "I heard the Carthenian government found a group of your kind on the outskirts. That they were taking care of it. I guess I never really thought about what that meant." Chell stared at him, confused as much by his words as by the flash of guilt that passed across his face. Inside her, the tiny spark of hope she thought he had extinguished appeared once again. Was it really possible he, a human of all creatures, might not turn her in? "Why are you going to Earth?" he asked, looking back up to her. "I'm sorry, I didn't know where it was going," Chell admitted, the stress returning full force as she suddenly became desperate beyond all measure to cling to that spark of hope. "I just hopped on the first train. I'll get on a different transport, go somewhere else. I won't hurt anyone. I promise. Just, please don't turn me in." The human stared at her, then shook his head vehemently. "No. Absolutely not." She stared, sagging slightly, but the hope stayed alive. The man's tone and his compassionate expression didn't match his words. He reached out and put a gentle hand on her shoulder carapace. "My name's Jack. Come to Earth with me. I'm sure my wife would love to meet you." Chell stared, not entirely comprehending exactly what the human, Jack, meant by those words. But a rush of emotions flooded through her as the spark of hope brightened. She wasn't out of the darkness, not even close. But that spark, perhaps it could be the lantern she needed to light her way. 8 years later. "Chell, dear. Dinner's ready." "Coming, Mum." Chell stood up, brushing sandy blonde hair out of her green eyes and grinning as she ran back to the house with the boundless energy of a preteen. She'd been told the color combination was rare among natural-born humans. But she didn't care. It reminded her of innocent times. Of playing so long ago in the place where the forest bordered the beach. Growing a new human host for Chell had not been cheap, but Jack had been more than willing to pay for it even before the Earth government stepped up to cover the cost. The social workers and scientists assigned to her case had been determined to grow something that was not just usable, but that functioned effectively alongside her physiology. Relearning how to walk and talk as an entirely new species had been difficult at first until she realized that they'd somehow adjusted this host's subconscious mind to work with her instead of against her. All she had to do was learn to trust the host and just allow it to take care of the involuntary stuff, which was more difficult than it sounded, but so worth it. It took away some of the detached feeling and made her feel integrated. Like she was her body and not just the thing piloting it. A weird, soft, lanky body, admittedly. But humans couldn't help the way they were made. Human diplomats had insisted they return the corpse of the Carthenian soldier as soon as they could. Jack had been mad enough to just throw it in an unmarked grave as he learned more of Chell's story. But that would have only exacerbated the diplomatic tensions between Earth and Carthenia. which were already at a record high thanks to the human public's unexpected outrage at the Changeling massacre, and the Carthenian government's adamant refusal to relinquish the extradition order for Chell, accusing her of war crimes. Human diplomats had attempted to point out that only combatants could be guilty of war crimes, to which the Carthenians countered that changelings were combatants by definition. Discussions broke down after the humans refused to accept such a, as their ambassador put it, convenient excuse for genocide, and imposed economic sanctions on those in power. Jack was leaning against the threshold with a smile and a hard screen in his hand as she approached. Calling his wife Lucy Mum had come naturally to Chell, but she couldn't bring herself to call Jack Dad, much to the man's chagrin. He still hadn't realized the impact introducing himself by name at the single most pivotal moment of her life had had. She'd never admit it to him, but Jack meant so more to her than Dad ever could. "Got a letter for you, kiddo," he said, brandishing the hard screen. She held out her hand for it, but he pulled back, holding it out of reach. "After dinner. Don't worry, I'm pretty sure it's good news." "Oh?" she asked curiously, but he grinned and shook his head. "Not gonna spoil the surprise. First dinner. And before that, we've gotta talk about your grades again." Chell winced, trying to brush past him to get to the dinner table, but was stopped when he put one of his arms in front of her. Even after all these years, and becoming human herself, the reach on those things still sometimes freaked Chell out. "But Jack," she groaned, rolling her eyes as she turned back to him. "No buts, young lady. You might look 7, but we both know you're not." Jack's serious expression broke for a moment and he grinned at her. "You're 15 and a half. Right?" "I'm still passing, though," Chell said sulkily, refusing to make eye contact. If she had one regret, it was adding the "and a half" way back when she'd first told him her age. To this day, Jack never missed an opportunity to tease her about it. "You're doing the bare minimum because you're bored and we both know it," he said, his tone towing the line between strict and sympathetic. "You know, you can always move up few years if it's too easy." "No," Chell said emphatically. "No. I don't want to leave my friends behind." And she paused. There was also the other thing, the one she hoped didn't need to be said. Jack had signed up for higher learning after returning from his tours abroad, and had graduated to become a first school teacher around the time she was entering Earth's schooling system herself. He was now working at the very same school she was attending. Being known as the teacher's kid was embarrassing. But, well, she didn't want to skip these years. She just didn't. Chell noticed her host's subconscious was causing her to fidget with her hands. Weird. She considered telling it to stop, but decided the behavior was harmless enough and allowed it to continue. "I don't want to move up. I'll do better, Jack, I promise." "All right then, kiddo. Above average from now on, got it?" he said, poking her cheek with an index finger. "Fine," she said, rolling her eyes again and receiving a grin and an affectionate punch to her shoulder as she pushed past him. After an excellent dinner of spaghetti bolognese, during which both Jack and Chell once again cheerfully admonished Lucy for not pursuing a career as a chef, Lucy nodded to Jack with a smile, who brought out his hard screen with a letter on it she'd seen before and handed it to Chell. Cautiously, she examined the official-looking graphic on the first page. Why on earth was the government contacting her directly? Most of the official stuff related to diplomacy with the Carthenians and her living situation had been settled years back, and it had always gone through her parents anyway. She swiped to the body of the letter and started reading. She hadn't gotten a few sentences in before she realized what this was about. She looked up at Jack and Lucy, her green eyes wide. They agreed. They're really going to fund it? Jack nodded, grinning. They're setting up a whole new department for it and everything. Apparently, they've already found 3 villages. And if you're willing, they'd like your help when they're ready to start making contact. Only if you're willing though. No pressure. The changeling outreach effort. A charitable humanitarian endeavor to carefully find and quietly approach isolated populations of changelings, doing their best to live by moral standards without giving them away to the local authorities and assist them in relocating to Earth. This would allow humanity to provide them the protection they needed to live safely, the technology they needed to live ethically, and the acceptance they needed to live prosperously. Jel swallowed, her wide eyes swimming in tears at the enormity of what was being put together. Because of Jack and because of her. Of course she'd help. Of course she would. Long ago, Jel's elders had told her to fear humans and to stay far, far away from them. Warned her that a human would be able to see right through her. See past the host to what she really was. They would never know how right they had been. The author's name and the link to original text is in the description. Consider tapping the thumbs up and pressing the subscribe button if you enjoyed this video.